Hello and welcome to another episode of The Scramble. Thanks for joining us. I'm your host, Jason Hawley. Today we'll primarily discuss the idea of happiness in Las Vegas, the United States, and globally, and recent increases in income inequality and among general financial distress in the U.S. and the world at large. In order to fully examine these issues, we have a special guest from Brookings Mountain West, Dr. Carol Graham. Thank you for being with us. It's a pleasure.
Thanks for having me.
Dr. Graham has conducted myriad studies examining global happiness levels among various populations in developing and developed nations. Dr. Graham continues her research of happiness for Brookings and remains based primarily in Washington, D.C. For the rest of our panel, we do have, to my left, Daniel Brady, a sophomore in political science. To my right, James Schaeffer, a sophomore and aspiring journalism major. And to my left, David Sarabian, a senior in political science and former State Department intern. Thank you all for being with us.
Thank you.
So today we will discuss this idea of happiness in general. And there has been this, I guess, Dr. Graham, you can attest to this increase in income inequality. But I guess this plays out to the bigger picture of happiness. And I guess what we could touch on first is how do we measure happiness? And how do we assess that in order to kind of look further at broader issues?
Well, that's a good question. The public is always interested in happiness, the concept of happiness, which is not particularly well defined. It could be happiness at the moment. It could be happiness with your life in general. As we measure well-being, which is the overarching term, subjective well-being, how people report their happiness and other dimensions of their well-being, we split these things up. So we have, on the one hand, we have life satisfaction, evaluative well-being, how people evaluate their lives as a whole. And that includes their capacity to make choices, to lead fulfilling lives, to get the kind of job they want to get, the education they want to get, or not. Mm-hmm. And then we also measure well-being in the daily experience sense. So were you stressed or worried as you went through your day? Were you happy at the moment? Did you smile a lot the day before? So what we're measuring on the one hand is kind of the life course element of happiness, and on the other, sort of people's daily quality of life. Mm-hmm. And so the term happiness gets a bit scrambled, which is obviously relevant for the show.
Absolutely.
In the sense that when you ask people how happy are you with your life in general, you're asking a life satisfaction question. Mm-hmm. If you say, how happy were you yesterday, you're measuring their positive moods and affect yesterday. So you're measuring both kinds of well-being. Mm-hmm. So typically we actually, in the measurement science, stay away from happiness, mm-hmm. the term, and use life satisfaction mm-hmm. or for the evaluative well-being, and mm-hmm. then we ask, how often did you smile yesterday? How often did you worry yesterday? Mm-hmm. How often were you angry yesterday? Whatever it might be, right. for the quality of life kinds of questions. Mm-hmm. It turns out that up to a certain point, having not enough income at all is bad for both kinds of well-being because you just can't get through life. But after basically median levels of income in the United States, and I find the same thing for Latin America and other places, we find it in a country, world scatter plot. More money won't make you smile more in a day. It won't make you be worried less in a day mm-hmm. once you are not, struggling. Mm-hmm. And then you get very little effect of money on that quality of life well-being. But you do find a correlation pretty much all the way up the income ladder between income or means and life satisfaction. Because the income is allowing people to make the kind of choices they want to make, to educate their children the way they want to get the kind of education they want to get. Mm-hmm. And so they're quite distinct. Mm-hmm. And they also, once we get to inequality, you'll mm-hmm. find that inequality may have different effects on each one.
Interesting. So I know that when, aside from actually measuring this idea of long-term versus daily, I know that given your current studies, perhaps we could say starting from 2008, has there been anything in particular that you've noticed with regard to the general picture globally here in the United States with regard to how people are, how satisfied they are with their lives? Has there continued to be this correlation with income and this satisfaction of being able to accomplish things, or has something like the Dow Jones become an indicator that's no longer really that relevant? Or what should we really look at?
It's surely relevant. It matters more or less to different people. We did some work on well-being during the crisis, and we found the huge drop, unprecedented drop in well-being levels during the time that the markets were stumbling down. And then they recovered very quickly once you had stability. Who fell the most? People that had a lot to lose, actually. So that was, at the time that uncertainty about the markets was driving everything, you found that people who actually at least had the capacity to have wealth in the market and or who were close to retirement age and were worried about their pensions had the biggest losses. And then everybody recovered. At the time, you saw very little change among, say, the unemployed because they were already unhappy. What you see now, though, is as the recovery, no longer the crisis, has dragged out, you've gotten a very differential recovery, and the well-being of people who had a lot to lose but have recovered has been all right. But people who have remained unemployed in a long-term sense, their well-being levels are very low because long-term unemployment is terrible for well-being across both dimensions. I would say if you were just to look over time, you'd probably find that our average levels of reported life satisfaction are probably about the same as they were before the crisis. So they had a dip and they recovered. And if you look globally, you get a very similar pattern. Again, you're going to have differences. If you are in Greece or Portugal or Spain, which are still struggling with the recovery, you've still seen things lower. Other places, Latin America, which fared very well during the crisis, they had some effect, but they didn't move much, and they're still quite high. So you get, on the one level, changes related to big events like the financial crisis, but those typically, once you get some sort of stability, people readapt, and they return to their close to where they were before, or sometimes even higher.
David, I want to turn to you because I guess all four of us here, being students in the university setting, may have, to more or less of an extent, experienced kind of these, wavering levels of life satisfaction. We all have high points and low points. But I'd like to hear from you with regard to your personal experience. What are your thoughts on some of the data that Dr. Graham has uncovered, and does it relate to your lived experience?
I'd say that with regard to life satisfaction, especially with the one statistic, I believe you said it was about 66% of people think their kids are going to be worse off than they are, is that there's certainly that mood that's out there, especially for kids of my generation, where it isn't what type of job I'm going to have, it's if I'm going to have a job. However, I do think that people underestimate the hope factor that you have to have as part of the well-being metric. It's that if you have that positive attitude that things can get better, especially if hard work will pay off, then especially for myself, because that's been my focus in life, is I'm a child that my mom came from Cuba when she was 9 years old, and she was able to get a graduate degree. And so in my own personal life, I've seen that hard work does come off, even if you came here when you were 9 years old, and for the first 10 years that you were living in the U.S., you were eating Spam every day because that's all you could afford. However, with other college students, I would say their perspective is a bit different, because maybe they haven't seen that much of a shift that can occur through education or through hard work. And so they don't necessarily value or seem to think that the hard work of getting good grades or the hard work of going for opportunities like being on this show or writing or extracurricular or something like that can actually pay off.
And that brings me, Daniel, I'd like to ask you and segue from that, because I've heard anecdotally, that there is this push among people that are between the ages of, say, 18 and 30, more so specifically 18 and 25. There's this kind of emergence of, or reemergence of the libertarian movement, essentially, of more young people essentially thinking that they are on their own, and as such, they do not want to rely on anything outside of them other than what they can control. That includes government subsidies, social welfare benefits, things of that nature. Do you agree with this? I mean, you are involved pretty heavily with politics.
The libertarian movement's always something that I find intriguing, but just to go on to your whole, this idea that we can only depend, the libertarian idea, we can only depend on what we can control ourselves. And I feel that segment's actually definitely risen, that belief's risen a lot among the youth I've had to deal with, especially when I was working on campaigns and talking to a lot of them. And it went back to one of the factors that I had actually read about when I was reading one of Dr. Graham's papers, and it's this idea that humans are, when we hit periods of uncertainty, is when a lot of our satisfaction, a lot of our things start to go down. It's because we don't have we don't have this sort of control. And when we don't have this control, it really gives us into a panic of, well, will this be here? Will we be able to do this? And in a lot of the political kids, a lot of the libertarians, a lot of the younger ones I talk to, they always express to me this idea that, you know, we need to be able to give ourselves a rock that we can rely on, something that will always be there, that we have. Just if it's our degree, a lot of the ones I've talked to, it's pushing them towards a graduate degree because they feel if they're a doctor, if they're a lawyer, they'll have more stability. They'll have something that won't be in flux as much as, say, my father, who used to own his own landscaping business, which heavily relied on other people. Mm-hmm. And it's just given this push towards this more desire for stability, this more control that they can have over their own lives.
Mm-hmm. James, do you agree with this this perspective? Have you kind of aligned yourself with the libertarian movement? And if so, or if not, what have you seen from your experience?
Well, you know, I don't know if I fully agree, but that's because I don't see myself or identify myself as a part of that movement. I have not seen any aspect of any actions I've taken of being a part of that movement. But on the perspective of the data that Dr. Graham has come up with, I have to say that I am an example and can definitely attest for the information that she has brought up. I mean, Southern Nevada and Southern Florida were the foreclosure capitals of the world, and living here during the recession, happiness or the economy truly does speak for happiness. The Dow does speak for happiness. But I do believe that there is an effect that I think is like a Cinderella effect. When we do hit our bottom, and we start to see a rise in the Dow, or the rise in the economy, happiness jumps to an all-time high. We know where the bottom is. And it is that kind of information that I kind of find is very interesting, because a lot of your information comes from polls taken between 2006 and 2012. Although we are coming off of the heels of the recession, I do feel a lot of information that can be, the most important information is information that can be gathered in those centers, Southern Nevada and Southern Florida, years after. I mean, you talk about the hope factor. Yes. The hope factor is something that can be aligned with the Cinderella effect, hoping that once that we've known where the bottom is, we're able to see the light at the end of the tunnel. And I do believe that that hope and that rock bottom do speak a lot to the happiness, to the level of happiness that we can test, that we can study.
So, Dr. Graham, I'd like to ask you then, I forget the name of the author who wrote this book, but when I hear James' answer, I think of the original Affluent Society, where it discusses the hunter-gatherers and this idea that hunter-gatherers, all their needs were met, essentially. Although they weren't exchanging currency, all their needs were met. They had the social needs met with their family. They were able to go out and hunt and gather each day. And so essentially, they had everything they needed, and by definition, they were affluent people. In essence, is happiness, or we could say well-being, is that something that we have to really kind of define strictly along economic lines? Or are we able to kind of branch away from that sometimes when looking at, I guess not happiness, but levels of well-being generally?
Well, I think material welfare is part of the story, and we find that consistently across people. But it goes down to the hunter-gatherer story, which is, at that time, if you were a hunter-gatherer and you had enough to hunt and gather, then you really weren't worried about the material dimension, and you could think about other things. The same goes, pretty much. In other words, more means allow you to have choices. Not enough means are terrible for well-being, because then you not only can't make choices in life, you don't have good health, which is very important to well-being. Lots of other things are bad, and those all correlate with well-being. But once you have enough material income, and that varies depending on society and also what expectations are and how you compare yourselves to other people, it gets a little more complicated. Yeah. But once people have sufficient means, you know, there are many, many other very important dimensions of well-being that matter tremendously and matter more than income. One is health, incredibly important. But the other really is, I think, this is one of the newest dimensions we're working with, is purposefulness, meaningfulness, meaningful work, not just being satisfied with your job, but really feeling that you are either appreciated work or doing work that matters. And I think that's why unemployment for people who want to be employed is so difficult, because they've lost part of their identity, part of their purposefulness. So that matters a lot. Social relationships matter tremendously to well-being or happiness. A range of factors that matter a lot. Instability typically is not good for well-being. If you're worried that you're going to lose everything that you just gained, or even their progress paradoxes that relate to instability. As in countries where things are changing a lot, think about China growing at 10% a year.
Right.
Well, as their growth rate has skyrocketed, their life satisfaction has plummeted, and that's big. And I think that's a short-term thing, but it's a period of a lot of change. The education you had before now doesn't mean the same thing. There's inequality that there wasn't. There's migration that's at tremendous levels.
Kind of like the progressive era, it seems.
Right. So there's a lot going on there. But I just wanted to step back and link this to the points about optimism and also sort of college-age kids and life satisfaction. Some of the most interesting areas in the research are trying to disentangle what is genetic or biological in terms of well-being patterns, and what's determined by the environment. And like the debate over environment versus genes and IQ, I think you get a similar interaction between these two in determining well-being levels. So there is a distribution of well-being across people, and there are some people that are at the sort of outliers at the top end. They're always happy regardless. There are people at the bottom that are always unhappy regardless. Some of that is just genetic. And that interacts with how you deal with your environment. So yes, more optimistic people are more likely to invest in their futures, to believe in their futures, and actually to make them better. That optimism can be determined in part inherently, and it's also in part determined by the models you have in your life, whether it's your parents or a professor, or whatever. And so it's a complicated part of the science of well-being measurement. Now it's also probably the most interesting part. And then in terms related to that, we find a very stable pattern across young and old people. There's a U-shaped curve, and I found this around the world, controlling for other things. So we're just looking at the pure effects of aging. But that sort of, people in their 20s are typically happier than the average, and there's sort of a low point around mid-40s. And then after that, older people get happier as they get older, as long as they're healthy and in some sort of partnership.
So every nation has a midlife crisis?
Well, I don't call it a midlife crisis because I don't think it really is a midlife crisis. We just see this trend. You can have a crisis at age 20, but yes, if you are, already in a low point, it may be easier to have crisis. We also find that, for example, reported psychological illness is the reverse of that at exactly the same point. So it's suggesting that it's biological. There's a big article in The Atlantic about that this month if you want to read more about it.
Absolutely.
But related to that goes back to the college-age kids' point. In economic terms, because I'm an economist, not a psychologist, I always like to describe it as the standard deviation of young people's experiences is much higher. So put that in layman's terms. When you're young and you have a bad experience, it's the end of the world, right? It seems like the end of the world. By the next day or the next week, it's usually not. But at the moment, as you get older and you've had lots of bad experiences, you are able to navigate them better. And psychologists research, a very talented psychologist called Laura Karstensen, has even shown that the emotional swings of young people and old people are very different. So that there's even though these are supposed to be your peak years, there are some very good things about your older years, and part of that is just you've got more of a benchmark to navigate emotional challenges, other life challenges, and retain your kind of innate well-being levels.
Interesting. Now, I'd have to ask, because I'm curious, when we talk about global averages and trends, have you ever wondered, I know that it would be great for somebody, including yourself, to look at some of the data that North Korean citizens might yield. what might be your estimation? I mean, just in a very, I guess, suppositional context, what do you estimate? Do you think you would find something similar in North Korea? They have, I guess we could argue, the system is fairly stable, but they're living in conditions that are akin to developing nations. Some could argue, and some
Worse
have
than most developing
worse than
nations.
that. And there's also been this idea, though, that they may not know or have this context to really know better, and that they may not be aware that they know that their conditions are unhealthy, but they may not be aware of how unhealthy they are, comparatively speaking, to other nations.
Right. So I think what you would find, and they don't let you in there to survey, so we don't know. I think you would find two things. You would find that their well-being levels are low, comparable to the rest of the world, but not as low as you might expect, precisely because they're adapting to unpleasant uncertainty, because they don't know enough about what it should be like. Equally important, freedom, just having political freedom is a very important correlate of well-being around the world. They don't have that, and they have a lot of fear in addition to that, and that's going to drive their well-being levels low. Again, they're not used to having freedom, so they haven't for so long that it's probably, if you imposed those political conditions on, think of an example, Chileans today, right, who have fought for their freedom, they have it, they have a thriving democracy, a thriving economy. If you impose those political conditions on Chileans today, you'd get a much more dramatic effect because people expect to have freedom.
Yeah.
But I think generally you'd find North Korea is right down at the bottom. And if you look at the scatter plot of countries, sort of average per capita GDP and average levels of life satisfaction, there are a lot of puzzles and mess in the middle. But at the very bottom, the countries that really score low, places like Belarus, Pakistan, Iraq, they score low precisely because life there really is bad. And that means there is no political freedom, there is a lot of conflict, violence, the economy is unstable, and that's, I think North Korea would be right down there with them.
Absolutely. James, did you have something to add?
Yeah, one of the things that you brought up in one of the first chapters of your book was the happiness for the right to vote, and how freedom and how freedom can contribute to happiness. On the subject of North Korea, I kind of one of the other things that you brought up was loyalty to nation. If you have a kind of a patriotism that it adds to your happiness, that attracts to your happiness, and like you mentioned, stability. Wouldn't you think that in North Korea, that since some citizens, since not knowing better, that's a guesstimation of the assumption of most North Koreans, have a loyalty to their nation and live a nearly stable life for the most part, wouldn't that contribute more to a higher happiness rate than most nations? As compared to those statistics, a stable nation with a large sense of loyalty to nation.
I'm not sure how stable it is. They've had repeated famines. They've had, the leader disappear in an unexplained way.
Unexplained to us.
Unexplained to us. I don't think they explained it to their people either. I'm not an expert on North Korea, but from the outside, conditions there are really, I think, would be intolerable by most people's standards, and I just can't imagine that would not show up.
Would you say that even if by our current standards of like the most horrible situation, if it is stable, would equal out to a subjective, high subjective well-being, as horrible of a status it may be, although it is stable?
Well, I think what you would get is that you might find that they don't score as low as you think they would on average, right? So higher than you think they would given the conditions, but compared to the rest of the world, they would score very low. But I'm making predictions. I have no idea.
David, can I give you the final word here?
Well, something that I found was interesting is you had discussed in the past about the two Americas. And we've discussed about how there are those people that do have hope with the hard work, but we also have these Americans that want to be a bit libertarian. And I found that it seems that there's a reflection of the two Americas in our youth. You have some that seem to be more libertarian in that I can only rely on myself. I have to do this. We can't deal with other intervention. But then you also have other kids that have the attitude of, what type of work do I want to do with my life? In fact, there have been a lot of, especially like in the Atlantic and other stories and other articles, where kids our age do not see that good change can happen through the government, or good change cannot happen unless it's an NGO, or they want to be part of a startup because it's the type of life that they want. And I was wondering if you've ever seen anything like that that I've been able to observe as well after reading about your literature, that there's this reflection of two Americas inside the youth as well.
Well, that's a very different take on the two Americas, because mine is very much about the difference
Well,
in
Dr.
time
Graham,
horizons.
if you can give us your final word in a few seconds, that would be great. I'm
Oh,
sorry to
okay.
interrupt.
No time. All right.
Oh, but just a brief synopsis, if you could. That would be
Okay.
great.
Well, what we find two Americas between people who have means and can invest in the future, plan for the future, have belief in hard work, and then people who are struggling day to day and just really live life at the moment, and they can't plan for the future, invest in their future, and therefore they don't. So that's a little distinct from this. I think you are talking about youth who have enough education to know which direction they want to take. I think it's quite influenced also by our very divided political debates now. But so that's a different kind of two Americas, a new one to look at.
Fantastic. Well, it has been a very, very interesting discussion, and thank you, Dr. Graham, for being with us again
Sure.
today. But that is all the time we have for today. Share your opinions and any ideas or topics you'd like to scramble about too. The scramble.unlv@gmail.com. You can also catch full episodes of The Scramble at UNLV-TV. For all of us here at The Scramble, thanks for joining us, and we hope to see you next time.